It's 1970 and you're flipping through channels when a cowboy slaps a woman, a church burns, and the hero's bleeding before the second act.
Me? Look at him, Soldier Blue. He can move twice as fast as you can in those stupid army pants. Take him off.
I can't fight my long johns.
You were expecting horses and gunfights. What you got felt angrier, sweatier, too tangled to wrap up in a standoff. These weren't your parents' westerns. They were warnings dressed in dust and blood. The Outlaw is often remembered for the woman at the center of its frame, but its real story was never about the frontier. Beneath the cowboy hats and revolvers, it was a film about obsession. How far one man could stretch the rules of storytelling, censorship, and morality in order to imprint his vision on a nation that claimed it wasn't ready to see it. Howard Hughes had money, control, and a fixation on Jane Russell that blurred the line between creativity and voyeurism. He cast her not just as a love interest, but as an emblem of temptation, and built the entire narrative, loosely inspired by Billy the Kid and Doc Holliday, around her body, her presence, and the discomfort she created. The plot was secondary, a blend of myth and fantasy that imagined a relationship between two historical outlaws who never met, and used their rivalry to justify the tension that Russell's character, Rio, brought into every scene. What made the film infamous wasn't what it showed, it was how it made people feel. Russell's presence was so hypersexualized that entire cities banned the posters, not the film. Hughes didn't retreat, he leaned in, orchestrating fake protests and leveraging outrage as marketing. While the film's release was delayed for years, its legend grew louder. Censors couldn't stop it, critics couldn't ignore it, and audiences, drawn by controversy, made it a success. In the end, The Outlaw wasn't a Western, it was a turning point, disguised as entertainment that rewrote what movies could dare to show. 100 Rifles pushed boundaries, not by accident, but by design. Set during the Mexican Revolution, it threw together Jim Brown, Raquel Welch, and Burt Reynolds in a political Western that masked its volatility with sun-drenched shootouts and sexual tension. But the real explosions happened off-screen. Raquel Welch, then one of Hollywood's top sex symbols, flatly refused director Tom Grease's pressure to appear fully nude in the now infamous shower ambush scene. Instead, she wore a drenched shirt that clung tighter than any studio plan, turning the moment into something more tantalizing than explicit. Burt Reynolds later said the scene worked better because it didn't bear everything. It hinted, it provoked. Welch's decision wasn't a fluke, it was a line she drew her entire career, defying an industry eager to cash in on her body while denying her autonomy. Behind the camera, tensions were constant. Welch and co-star Jim Brown clashed hard enough to sour any chemistry, with Burt Reynolds often stuck in the middle as peacekeeper. The friction spilled into future projects. By the time Fuzz came around, Welch refused to share scenes with Reynolds altogether. Yet paradoxically, Reynolds later testified in her favor during a lawsuit, a gesture that added another layer to their strange, volatile alliance. The interracial romance between Brown and Welch's characters, rare and risky for 1969, was censored in several countries. It wasn't the violence or the revolution that scandalized the world, it was her wet shirt, his skin tone, and what Hollywood tried to bury under spectacle. Heaven's Gate opened with a Harvard graduation and ended with a massacre in the Wyoming plains. Somewhere in between, Michael Cimino burned through $44 million, rebuilt entire frontier towns in Montana, and dragged a production so far off course it nearly killed United Artists. The film followed Jim Averill, a U.S. Marshal trying to hold the line between immigrant farmers and the cattle barons who wanted them gone. But the plot moved like background noise to Cimino's obsession. He waited days for the right cloud to pass, shot 50 takes of a man lighting a cigarette, and filmed a waltz on roller skates like it was holy scripture. Everything looked incredible. Nothing felt easy. By the time the private army shows up, guns drawn, lists in hand, the point is already made. The state chose power, and Cimino chose to show what that looked like when no one was left to soften the frame. The violence didn't cut away, the immigrants didn't get saved, and when the dust settled, the studio was broke. Critics called it bloated, incoherent, indulgent. They weren't wrong, but buried in all that chaos was a film that refused to flatter the mythology it came from. Cimino turned the Western into a political autopsy. He also turned Final Cut into a cautionary tale, and no director before or since ever spent that much money filming class warfare in a corset. Duel in the Sun began with a murder and ended with one, but everything in between felt like a dare. Selznick didn't just produce the film, he practically stalked it into existence, reshaping the Western around Jennifer Jones and his obsession with her. She played Pearl Chavez, a biracial orphan written to provoke fears about race, desire, and defiance. Selznick cast her as a half-breed temptress, covered her in dark makeup, and built an entire narrative around whether she should be desired, destroyed, or both. The film was soaked in melodrama, violent brothers, forbidden lust, sunsets so rich they looked fake. But what made it dangerous wasn't the plot. It was the stare. Every shot of Jones was dialed to maximum allure, which critics clocked as less direction and more projection. One reviewer said Selznick filmed her like a Boy Scout who just discovered sex. Behind the camera, the control was just as intense. Selznick clashed with director King Vidor, rewrote scenes mid-shoot, and marketed the film as Lust in the Dust. It was banned in cities, slashed by censors, and condemned by watchdogs who called it perverse, and yet it made money. Pearl didn't survive the story, but the film did, not because of its romance or its gunfights, but because it exposed what happened when a studio let one man project his fantasy onto 35mm and dared the audience to look away. Django dragged a coffin through the mud, but inside it wasn't a body, it was a machine gun. That image alone tells you everything about where spaghetti westerns were headed in 1966. Franco Nero played the title character like a ghost with a vendetta, walking into a border town ruled by racists and outlaws, and turning it into a war zone. The violence was relentless, the mud was ankle deep, and nothing felt clean or mythic. Sergio Corbucci shot it like a horror film, low light, dead eyes, music that hung in the air like smoke. But the controversy didn't stop at the gore. Django sleeps with a mixed-race sex worker, gets nailed to a cross, and returns from near death just to pull a trigger with his teeth. That level of brutality and the audacity to center a relationship between a white anti-hero and a woman of color got the film banned in the UK for decades. Corbucci leaned into the bleakness, stripping the Western of heroism until all that was left was survival. The budget was low, the dubbing was rough, but none of that mattered. What stuck was the attitude. Django wasn't a legend, he was a consequence. And long after the movie faded from theaters, dozens of knockoffs tried to borrow his name, hoping some of that dirt, blood, and chaos would stick. The Beguiled was supposed to be a Civil War drama, but by the time Clint Eastwood's character woke up in that southern boarding school, the power had already shifted. He was wounded, charming, and surrounded by women who hadn't seen a man in months. What followed wasn't romance. It was silence, glances, and a slow erosion of trust. Don Siegel didn't direct it like a Western, he directed it like a trap. The rooms felt smaller every scene, the women more unreadable, the tone harder to pin down. Eastwood's Corporal McBurney tries to seduce his way to safety, whispers to the young ones, flattery to the headmistress, but the house seems to close in on him. Then, without warning, they cut off his leg. Not to save him, but to stop him. That's where most audiences drew the line. The amputation wasn't heroic, it was punishment. Critics called it perverse, unfocused, mean. Eastwood clashed with the studio over how ugly the character could get, and on set, tensions weren't just in the script. He had an affair with Joanne Harris, fought over the ending, and resented the marketing that tried to sell the movie as sexy. It wasn't. It was sour, tense, and uncomfortably quiet. Even the soundtrack, the church organs, the whispers added pressure. Audiences didn't know what to make of it. Was he the victim, the villain, the warning? The film didn't answer. It just let him bleed on the floor and left the room before anyone could clean it up. Soldier Blue opened with a massacre and ended with another one. Everything in between was a test of how much truth an audience could handle before turning away. Candice Bergen played a white woman who had lived with the Cheyenne and didn't flinch when calling the U.S. Army murderers. Peter Strauss played a soldier still trying to believe in rules, uniforms, and orders. Their arguments felt like the real plot. The romance was there, but it never softened the film. They argued across rivers, gunfire, and silences that dragged for too long. And then came the ending. A cavalry raid filmed in slow shots that refused to blink, rape, mutilation, slaughter. Ralph Nelson directed it like he wanted people to walk out, and many did. Others accused him of exploitation. It was one of the first westerns to show the American military as genocidal and systematic. The film was compared to Vietnam, banned in countries and barely screened in others. Bergen stood by it, even as studios stopped calling. Critics were split, some called it brave, others called it sick. Peter Strauss later said the shoot changed him, but wouldn't say how. The film didn't survive on box office. It survived on reputation. The kind that doesn't fade, just gets quieter. When people talk about the Western falling apart, this is one of the films they're talking about. Not because it failed, but because it aimed straight at a myth and refused to look away, even when everyone else already had. The Return of a Man Called Horse picked up where its predecessor left off, but by 1976, the cultural landscape had changed. What was once framed as spiritual awakening now read more like a white man's redemption fantasy with a bigger budget. Richard Harris returned as John Morgan, English aristocrat turned Sioux warrior, only this time he came back not as a guest, but a liberator. His tribe had been massacred, enslaved, and stripped of their land. The villains weren't hiding either. They were white traitors and bureaucrats backed by corrupt soldiers. What followed was a revenge narrative that dressed itself in respect, but couldn't shake its outsider gaze. Harris wanted the character to be made chief. The director refused. They fought about tone, focus, even screen time. Off camera, Harris drank, argued, and made it clear who the film was really built around. Language that had been carefully researched in the first film was dropped. Sioux roles went to white or racially ambiguous actors. Cultural rituals were trimmed or stylized to fit pacing. This was Hollywood repackaging anthropology as spectacle. The message was still there: injustice, betrayal, resistance, but the perspective felt skewed. Activists criticized its white savior arc. Critics praised its ambition, then questioned its authenticity. It made money, but not history, and when the studio looked back, they didn't see legacy, they saw marketable pain filtered through blue eyes and war paint. Navajo Joe debuted in the middle of the spaghetti western craze, not to start a revolution, but to cash in on one. Released in 1966, it rode the spaghetti western wave straight into the desert and cast Burt Reynolds, half Cherokee by ancestry, but not by Hollywood standards, as a stoic Native American hell-bent on revenge. He wore a headband, rode fast horses, and scalped white men with righteous fury. The story was simple: settlers murdered his tribe, and now they had to pay. But what made the film stick wasn't the plot, it was the disconnect. Reynolds played it straight, but the film wrapped him in cliches so thick they bordered on parody. He later called it one of his worst movies, saying he only took the role to get experience and a European vacation. The Italian crew spoke little English, the script was rewritten daily, and director Sergio Corbucci, fresh off Django, treated the project like a warm-up act. Despite the title, no Navajo customs, language, or history appeared in the film. The score by Ennio Morricone slapped, but the cultural representation didn't even try. It was pure pulp exploitation by design, with Reynolds painted brown and the audience asked to cheer. Yet the violence, the music, and Reynolds' charisma gave it staying power. Years later, Tarantino would name-drop it in Kill Bill. But for all its noise, Navajo Joe remains a footnote. Not because it failed, but because it showed how easily a culture could be flattened into a costume just to fit the frame. The Wild Bunch opens with children watching a scorpion torn apart by ants, and somehow that ends up being one of the gentler moments. Sam Peckinpah's film follows Pike Bishop and his gang outlaws too old for the 20th century, too stubborn to fade quietly. It's 1913, and the world is modernizing without them. Their last heist isn't about riches, it's about relevance. The story lingers in betrayals, broken codes, and the slow rot of men who've outlived their myth. Peckinpah shoots violence with surgical obsession, bullets slow to a crawl, blood splashes like oil paint, and every death lands with weight. It's not just brutal, it's exhausting, because that's the point. Behind the camera, things were just as frayed. Peckinpah pushed his crew past reason, staging action sequences so intense, stuntmen were injured by blanks fired too close. William Holden numbed himself with alcohol, and the cast navigated a director who didn't so much manage tension as weaponize it. The MPAA nearly gave it an X rating. Censors demanded edits, critics split down ideological lines, some walked out in protest, others called it a masterpiece. What made the film truly dangerous wasn't the blood, but the morality, or lack of it. These weren't cowboys with codes, they were ghosts with guns. And when they walk into that final shootout, it's not about justice, it's about obliteration. The Wild Bunch didn't evolve the Western, it dismantled it. With noise, with violence, and with the kind of ending that leaves the audience staring at smoke, wondering what's left to believe in.